Hello and welcome back to the second half of the What is Memory unit. So we've already kind of got a rough definition of what memory is, right? Remember, it's something to do with the brain and something to do with accessing information. And what do we do with that information? We encode it, we store it, and retrieve it. Okay, cool. So we know all that stuff. Have we ever seen that with our own eyes, though? Have you ever seen someone create a memory in their brain? No. I haven't either, right? So that's not something that we can do. We can't just pop open people's heads. So yeah, we know that memories exist, right? But what is our evidence for that? And that's actually I want that to be kind of one of your questions every single week for every single article is, what is the evidence? Is this good evidence? Is this compelling evidence? Are there good reasons to justify these claims that are being made? So if we are trying to apply that to whether or not memories exist, what evidence do we have that memories exist? Usually, our kind of proof is our behavior, right? How do I know that you can play piano? Because you show me that you can play piano, right? So how do I know that you remembered the content for an exam? Well, because you did well in the exam, right? But you can very quickly see how that becomes problematic, right? That just because you learn something doesn't always mean that you can actually do it, right? So those of you that have played instruments before, that know how to play instruments, you remember how to play something, but then maybe whenever you're in front of people, you get nervous and you mess up a little bit, right? That would indicate that you don't remember that, right? Which we know is not true. And the same for an exam, that you may have studied a lot, and then whenever you go to take the exam, you don't do well, even though you studied all that stuff, and afterwards you remember it. So our exam is not a good indicator of what you remember, because it doesn't always accurately reflect what you have remembered. So the proof of memories existing is very difficult. It's not always reliable, and it relies a lot on demonstrating. It relies a lot on showing what you have remembered, even though that can sometimes be misleading, that sometimes we remember things, we just can't really show it, right? So the way that you know that you have a memory is because you can remember these things, but the way that I know that you have a memory is basically because I ask you about something and you tell me or you demonstrate to me that you have experienced this thing and that you can act on it, right? So that's how we know. So that's very, very different from how we would measure a lot of things in science. So that's very different than thinking about biology or physics, like how we would measure things like width and circumference and speed and things like that. Those are things that you can objectively measure with empirical means. And we do the same thing in psychology, but it's much more tricky. We can be objective and we can be empirical, but we have to be very careful. It's not as simple as just putting a ruler on something. It's not as simple as measuring it with a yardstick or putting it on a scale and weighing it that way. And so this problem where we have some difficulty in being able to see where memories are in the brain is something called the black box problem. So this is a very philosophical kind of exercise. So bear with me for a moment. This is a problem with a lot of psychology, specifically things that are not part of the applied behavior analysis world. Is we have what's called the black box problem, which is that we know that there's something going on in the brain, but we don't really know what it is unless we use some kind of high-end cutting-edge technology, like an fMRI or an EEG or something like that. And so in the history of psychology, that was often a very big problem, and as an example, and I won't go into too much detail because I know we're not all psych majors, but just to give you some context about this problem, back in like the 30s, whenever behavior analysis was very, very in vogue and very popular and dominant in our science, behavior analysts really downplayed the role of emotion and consciousness and attention, because those are things that can't really be measured externally, right? You can't really weigh how much attention weighs. You can't really measure how long consciousness is, and because of that, you can only measure through indirect means. And for behavior analysts, that was not that was just not worth doing, right? They really wanted psychology to be basically at exactly like biology in terms of being a hard science. So it's really so even though I can ask you a question and you can answer it, I don't really know what's going on in your brain, right? And that presents a problem. That's called the black box problem. We see information go in, we see information go out, but we don't know how that information is being treated in the brain. So we can use some kind of super cool technology going on, but whenever we get activation here, there's also some other problems, which is that activation just could be random thoughts. People could be guessing. It could be a different behavior that is being activated, or that is activating the brain at that given moment, and so that's not always super reliable either, which is a whole nother class to talk about. Not this one, but if you were taking a neuroscience class, then you'd talk more about that there, maybe. But what we do as psychologists and as educators and also people that are going into criminal justice or pretty much any field, the way that we test memory is by seeing what happens whenever we ask people questions or when we give people prompts in which they can remember things. So you give them a question and you see that their answer, and if they can answer it correctly, then we assume that what's going on in here is some accurate representation of memory, that they must have an accurate memory because they answered it correctly. If they get it wrong, then the answer would mean that maybe they didn't remember what that was, or maybe they weren't paying attention in the first place and they didn't remember. So it could be an inaccurate representation of what's going on in their mind, or it could be that it was just never really brought into their mind. They weren't paying attention. So you can kind of see then that what we can do there is that we can continually ask questions, continually monitor the answer, and see how the question changes the answer, and see how the information that's going in can be changed, or how that information is represented in the mind. So there are 5 different kinds of memory that we're going to be talking about, or 5 different ways that we can test memory. So we're going to be talking about these throughout the semester. So don't feel like you need to write all this stuff down now, because we're going to be experiencing this again and again and again. One of the most kind of commonly ways that we measure memory is through something called recall. And recall is whenever you ask somebody a question and they have to generate what that memory is. So if I asked you, what is your middle name? That is an example of recall. You're telling me something. If I ask you, please tell me the first 3 digits of pi, that is recall. You are creating that memory. You're telling me what you remember. So you're generating what that is. That's one test. But we also have recognition tests. And recognition tests are basically going to be whenever, if I were to say, I want you to tell me what your middle name is out of these 3 examples. And then I gave you 3 different names and you had to pick the one that was your middle name. That is an example of recognition. We can see this a lot in other fields like criminal justice, for example, whenever you have things like a police lineup, right? Where you look at a series of faces and you have to recognize the person, the perp, right? You have to recognize the person that was at the scene of the crime or involved with the crime. And in that case, that is recognition. You're not telling people what that person looks like, you're recognizing them. So you have looked at a selection of choices and then you've made your response there. The fascinating thing here is that these two are different questions, but they also are activating different kinds of memories. We'll go into it in the next couple of weeks, but recall is basically your ability to remember conscious events, and recognition is your ability to retrieve unconscious events. But like I said, that's a big idea that we're going to be exploring a lot in the next couple of weeks. We also have implicit tests, which is where you don't ask someone to give a voluntary response, but you kind of watch how they behave, and that non-conscious process informs us of what's been remembered. Source judgment, which is where we tell people, or we use this to help determine where that memory was created and how it was created. And finally, meta-memory judgments, which is kind of like our reflection of what our memory is. So if I asked you, do you have a good memory, and you said yes or you said no, that is an example of a meta-memory judgment, where you are making a judgment about your own memory. So it's like a memory for a memory. All right, so just to give you a quick kind of example of each of these things, if I said, what is her birthday, and you told me July 10th, 1998, that is an example of recall, because I've given the question and you've given the answer. So I know that you have a memory here because you were able to tell me what it was. But we can change the questions around a little bit, and by changing the questions, then we can look at how that impacts accuracy, how that impacts how quickly you can remember things, or whether or not you've remembered all of it. These are the factors that we as psychologists are looking for to help us understand how memory works. So if I were to ask you, what was your last birthday like? And then you said, oh, it was at Chuck E. Cheese Pizza, that is an example of recall, right? But if I just asked you, when was your birthday? And you told me, that doesn't necessarily tell me that you remembered what you were doing on your birthday, but we can figure that out by asking specific kinds of questions. Here's another kind of memory test. This is recognition. If I said, is her birthday July 1st, 1998, and you would say no, that would be an accurate response, but here you're not having to recall it. You're not having to generate that response. You're just making a decision, yes or no, based on this. Is this the same or is this different as what you remembered? An implicit memory test would be like, can you show me how to tie your shoes? And if they can tie their shoes, then that is memory that is evidence of memory that they have learned to tie their shoes. The fascinating thing, and I don't want to get into it too much just yet because we're going to go into it later. But the fascinating thing about this is that everybody knows how to tie their shoes, pretty much. But if I were to ask you, write down the instructions for how to tie your shoes, people have a lot of trouble with that. People have a lot of trouble if I were to say, whenever you're tying your shoes, which the laces go over which first, left or right? Which lace goes over the top? People stumble for a moment and they think about it, and what do? They go through the motions themselves to figure it out. That is an example of an implicit test, where you can show me that you know something, you remember something by simply doing it. You don't have to generate that response or whatever. You can just show me by doing it. You can play an instrument. You can tie your shoes. You can use your keyboard for muscle memory, things like that. A source judgment would be like, how did you know it was her birthday? And you have to remember where you saw that information. And that is an example of a source judgment. And then finally, meta memory would be like, are you forgetting whose birthday it is today? You think about your own memory and you say, I don't think that I'm forgetting anybody. That is an example of meta memory. Or if you're preparing for an exam and you think to yourself, I'm not ready. There's a lot of things I don't remember. That is a meta memory judgment as well. We're going to be spending a lot of time this semester in the brain. I'm not going to get too in detail with it because I know not all of us are psychology majors, and I want to keep it broad. But just to give you an idea of where we are this semester, we are going to be spending a lot of times here in the hippocampus. Hippocampus is this kind of, to me it looks kind of like a bean or a string bean. That's right here in the brain, in the middle, in the center, and so it's part of the medial temporal lobe for those of you that are keeping track at home. And you can see it's connected to all these different places, like the amygdala, which is responsible for emotional processing, for the hypothalamus, which is responsible for sensory management, for the cerebellum, which is responsible for basic motor functions such as balance, and the brainstem, which is used for a lot of automatic behaviors like respiration and things like that. Over here, way in the front, we have the prefrontal cortex, which is where we do a lot of conscious, deliberate thought. So a lot of our abstract thinking takes place up here. So we'll talk more about how all these areas interact with one another as the semester goes on. Here is a disgusting example of why it's called the hippocampus, which I believe is either Latin or Greek for seahorse. This is a seahorse, and this is the hippocampus. That's why it's called that, is because it looks like a hippocampus. All right, so I think that's pretty much everything that I wanted to talk about in this particular unit. So that should give you all the context that you need just the basics to get into our first article. Our first article is not really about how memory or what memory is, but it's giving you an example of something that is fascinating about memory. And so I don't expect you to be a complete expert on false memory, which is what the reading is about, but now you have kind of an understanding of how we test for memory. And yeah, if you have any questions, let me know. I'll show you very quickly. If you're still hanging in there, one of the activities that I have planned was to do a game of telephone. You may have done telephone before, where in telephone you whisper something to somebody, and that person whispers that information to somebody else. That person whispers that information to somebody else. That person whispers information to somebody else, and then by the end you compare. What did the first person remember? What did the last person remember? And usually we find that those messages are very, very different. And that is actually a good representation of how memory works. The more this information is being used, the more likely it is to be distorted, which is very different than how we normally think about memory, right? We normally think about, oh, well, if you are thinking about it and accessing it all the time, then you're probably going to have a really good memory for it. That's not always the case, though. But we'll talk more about that as the semester goes on. So if you have any questions, let me know. Otherwise, I will see you in the Zoom call. Bye.